Gene, thank you very much for joining us. I have to lead off with the question everyone has, but I'm sure you know how to answer it by now. Apple, $1 trillion, especially given the recent weakness of the stock. One, how do you get the numbers? And two, what fancy new products they have coming down the pike that'll repeat what they did in the last decade? Or don't they have to? First, how do you get the trillion?
You know, it's actually not that hard. It seems like such a big number, but when you step back and look at the numbers, you get there by thinking a year from now, a year and a half from now will be in 2014. And we look at that point, investors are going to be looking at the 2015 numbers. And we get to that $1 trillion valuation by simply our 2015 earnings estimates times 12 times, 12 multiple on that, which actually is a conservative multiple given the fact they've been growing at 20% plus.
Does that mean they have $500 per share in cash by then?
Well, you know, thankfully they are doing the dividend. If they didn't give the dividend, it probably would be about $500 a share in cash. But what they'll do is they'll probably keep it right around $100 billion in cash, only $100 billion, and give the rest back to investors.
So in essence, you're just extrapolating they'll do more of the same. One of the things that we see happen is that when a company has very high margins, and we see it beginning with Apple, competitors come in. How can they keep those kind of margins at that kind of size?
I've covered Apple for 8 years, and I think what happened is this shift to the ecosystem. To answer your question is, Apple's ecosystem is what differentiates it today versus some of the other products. And to give you an example is when the iPod came out, there was a lot of competitors, and all of them had better features, like the first to have a color screen, for example, and people really thought that was going to be the end of the iPod. But ultimately, it was the connection between iTunes Music Store and the iPod, that hardware-software connection that created the first Apple ecosystem. And so as we get to the phone, the iPhone and the iPad, and ultimately the Apple television, all of these products have that same ecosystem. So the good news in terms of competition, it's not about creating a better featured product. These competitors need to replicate the ecosystem, which is virtually impossible at this time.
Well, take the big three, iPod, iPad, iPhones. Do you just see them doing improvements on each that everyone will feel they have to buy it again, like we used to have annual model changes on cars?
Yeah, and the funny thing is over time is that the improvements, yes, to answer your question, it's just these incremental improvements, but the improvements don't need to be really earth-shattering for people to upgrade. And I'll give an example is that we survey people in the US, and about 93% of them say their next phone is going to be an iPhone. They don't even know what the features of the next phone are going to be, but this interest level in upgrading it. And I think with Apple, it's just these little incremental feature improvements that get people to stay within the ecosystem. And so really at the core of our $1 trillion outlook is that they continue, as you said, to make the existing products better, drive into emerging markets, and then come out with some new product categories like Apple Television.
Is it the kind of thing where iPhones and the improvements thereon are cheap enough where you don't mind laying out $300 or $400 every year or 2 years?
Yeah, people don't, and there's been a shift to how people view their phone.
What do you call them, rebuys?
Rebuys, upgrades, but you see a shift in terms of how people are valuing their phones. And a few years ago, their computer was their most valuable technology. But when you survey people today and say you have a choice between a computer, a phone, and a tablet, they choose their phone. And so what that means is that Apple is able to continue to keep high premiums for these products because people's lives, unfortunately, are being centered around their phone. They check it hundreds of times a day. And so the value that they're getting is actually very high. So we're surprised when we go to consumers that you wouldn't think could buy an iPhone and ask them, would you be willing to pay $600 for this? And they say absolutely.
So there's more than a cult of personality involved here?
I think it is. I think it's much more than that. That was a lot of fear in terms of from investors, but the reality is this ecosystem is really what's going to be driving this.
Just to jump for a minute, do you see the same phenomenon with Amazon and their iterations of Kindle?
Amazon, yes. I mean, they're making some good inroads, but Kindle's got a tough road ahead of it. And part of the reason why is that Amazon's not a hardware company. They're basically putting together a lot of the parts that's in the market and try to create some cheap products. The biggest feature for Amazon for their hardware Kindle is price. And at the end of the day, people really want something more than just something inexpensive.
Now, in the case of Apple, we mentioned all the cash they have. Do you feel that human nature being what it is, that can lead to a lack of focus, that you have so much cash, you're tempted to throw some here, from there, cover every bet, and not do what Jobs did when he came back in the late 90s, say, get rid of all this stuff, we're just going to focus on one or two or three big things?
It's definitely, how Apple kind of emerges and grows post-Jobs is a question that remains. The good news is a lot of the management team was there with Jobs. But I think what stands to your question is if you look at Apple's, the amount that they spend on R&D is very little compared to the rest of tech. And the yield that they get on that is very high. And so especially when you compare it to Microsoft, it's about a quarter of the spend, but exponentially more yield from that. So I think their history is that they've been smart about how they've done these investments, at least in the last decade, and I don't see any reason why they'd start spending like drunken sailors on products that aren't going to go anywhere.
Well, as you look at high tech, is there sort of an inverse correlation? The more you spend on R&D, somehow the return just disappears like the old IBM?
We haven't looked at it, but if you look at the players that spend the most, I think you would argue that their innovation has been the least. And so I think that you're onto something.
How is Apple today, as far as you can see, trying to preserve a unique culture and not have it turn into ossification?
They are very focused on trying to maintain that culture. And I think part of it is they even have classes and coursework for existing employees to try to carry on the tradition of Jobs. For example, is just the relentless attention to details. And so when someone leaves Apple, there's been all these basic students that have been following that. And as we've followed employees who have left and gone other companies, one perfect example is Nest Labs. They make a thermostat. Sounds very simple, but the attention to detail by Tony Fadell, who's one of the first iPod people, is a sign of that culture and that focus. And so I think that is alive and well and will be passed down generations at Apple.
Getting back to the $1 trillion thing on Apple, you think they can do that with just upgrading what they have and still preserve the margins?
That's the beauty of the $1 trillion, is I think they can get there with the products that they have. The one that they need to still come out with is the television. We think that's going to come out in 2013, probably announced later this year, but that's a small piece to this overall puzzle. And the reason why you can get there on their existing products is the markets that they're selling are massive. If you look at the phone market, for example, it's about 1.4 billion units a year. And right now, Apple, this year, we have them selling about 140 million iPhones. And so the opportunity of just driving this not only into existing markets like the US and Western Europe, but into emerging markets is huge.
Now, you look at a market like China or even India. Is there a fear there that they'll say, we like our own, and as they've done with other companies, sort of start putting nails on the road? Yeah,
there's always fear with that. This last March quarter that Apple reported was the first quarter we could point to and show that despite some of that fear, that the Chinese in particular are really buying up these iPhones. And that was really the takeaway, is that despite the fact that the Chinese don't have the same disposable income as people in Western Europe and the US, they're basically spending a month, 2 months salary to buy these phones. It's really amazing to see what's going on.
So the cult lives there.
The cult is alive and well. I mean, when they opened up, when they were going to start selling the new iPhone back in January, it was basically a mob scene outside of these stores. They couldn't even open them because there were so many people wanting to buy them.
So on the TV, how do you see that unfolding? It's content, it's hardware, but what's going to be different than what we can get now, which is quite cheap when you see what's available now at Best Buy? Quite cheap.
We think that the TV is going to be the biggest thing in consumer technology since the smartphone came out really 7 years ago. This is a really kind of a seismic shift in terms of how people use their television. And there's examples of it that are out today that don't really work that well. But at the core of what we think Apple's going to bring is, first, the ability to use one remote control. I mean, everyone has an experience when they go to a friend's house and they can't actually turn the TV on. That'll be gone because it'll be a unified interface. The second is on the content side. We think they're going to do some innovative things on content that allow you not to be worried about schedules on TV anymore, and just it's when you want to watch things. And lastly, on gaming side, we think that they're going to do some integration on gaming. So there's no reason to have like a Wii, for example, or a PlayStation or an Xbox. So those are kind of the three core things, and I think that all in an Apple design, it's going to really shake up the market and get people excited about TVs again, which hasn't been that great of a market.
And these will be big TVs?
Big TVs, yep. We're talking somewhere between 42 and 50 inches is our guess as far as how big the initial ones will be.
And you've seen enough clues to make you believe this will come to pass, finally.
Finally, yeah. We've started working on this back in 2009 and publishing back then, and we've done a lot of work relative to meeting with companies in this space. And the question is not, is Apple Television real? The question is, what's the timing?
Getting beyond Apple, even though that seems to be the universe these days, another biggie, Google. Are you as optimistic on that as Apple? Are they as focused as Apple is, or is there a danger there they're going to start going everywhere?
Well, I think Google and Apple are on a collision course right now. I think Google they're really the oxygen of the internet. Their advertising business, no one's going to touch search. And it's so ubiquitous that people don't even realize how much they use Google. But outside of the search side, you know, they are on this collision course, and we think there's going to be more friction in the future versus less. And at the end of the day, we think there's upside to Google shares, but more upside to Apple shares. And I think you're going to see some of the symptoms of the stress between the relationship between Apple and Google with the next version of the iPhone. We'd expect that, for example, Google Maps that comes pre-installed on the iPhone, wouldn't be surprised if Apple has their own mapping technology that they put in there, kind of boot Google out on that. But your Google search toolbar will definitely still be there.
What other areas are they going to collide in other than Maps?
Yeah, I think just the broader phone market in general. Google's going to be closing this Motorola acquisition. They're going to be spending a lot of money to really try to recreate Apple's model. And so I think it's just going to be a pretty nasty fight here in the next few years between those two companies.
What do you mean when you say Google's got to get mobile right?
It's right now they haven't really replicated that ecosystem that Apple's done so successfully. And so that's one of the reasons why we think that they are planning to buy Motorola. So when we talk about getting mobile right, it's really about creating products that have a similar ecosystem. On the last earnings call, Larry Page, the CEO of Google, talked about this ecosystem, the importance of it, but it really showed that they want to do it in the future. They're not doing it today. Apple is. That's the core difference.
Was Larry Page looking at Steve Jobs and saying, we got to do more of that here when he took over? Yeah,
it probably actually started back with Eric Schmidt, and there's some, kind of a very colorful history of things that have been said between the two companies around the phones, and obviously Apple accusing Google of stealing their technology and ripping off their technology. But I think that Larry Page is really taking the baton from Eric Schmidt, the former CEO, and keeping that momentum going to try to create a better alternative to Apple iPhone.
Cisco got ripped apart the other day. What's their future? Is Huawei going to just eat them, or well, they're going to come up with great new stuff? What's their future? Well,
Cisco's not a company that I directly cover, but I can say that Huawei is having a big impact on their business, and also they're kind of this broad enterprise indicator in terms of spending, and I think that's one of the reasons why that the stock really got hit, is that just the environment with Europe has been soft. But as far as competitively, I think despite Huawei, they're still in a great position longer term.
Getting to Amazon, what's the future of Amazon? Should they buy something like Best Buy and just go all the way, or?
No, they'll destroy Best Buy, and they have a plan of global domination. It just happens to be with e-commerce. And I think one of the statistics that always impresses me is the percentage of things that are bought online is actually very low still.
Like
in the US, 6% in the US. In Europe, it's maybe fractionally higher. In the rest of the world, it's lower. Eventually, through our survey work, we think that number is going to be 20 to 30% in the next decade. And so that's just going to have a huge ramp. Amazon's in a pole position. They've done some innovative things even today. I thought this is kind of funny, is that when you check out at Target or Walmart or Best Buy, you know how you have the candy and batteries and all that stuff? Yep. It's kind of last minute ads. Amazon just today announced they're going to be doing the same thing as you go through the checkout. If you want to get that pack of gum, they'll drop it in your box for you. So they're doing it all.
Baidu, where?
Baidu's in a great place. longer term, it really is a bet on China. If you believe that China is going to continue to grow, obviously there's a lot of controversy around it. So Baidu, the beautiful thing about that model is it's a state-sponsored monopoly in a good business with search. There's no way Google's ever going to compete with Baidu. They have basically 95% share. So our thinking, we're still believers in China as a growth story. And based on that, we think this is a great kind of broad play with a relatively low corporate governance risk. There's obviously been a lot of fraud in China. So you want to try to maximize your exposure to the economy and minimize your exposure to fraud. And Baidu seems like a good balance between those two.
Looking at China, what do you think the prospects are of becoming a real innovator instead of just saying, Google, we know what you're doing, stay out?
You know, I've been working in China since 2007. We've been waiting for that for a long time, for kind of the innovation curve versus the, I guess, the more of the copy curve. And we just really haven't seen it yet. And I'm sure over time they'll get there, but hard to say when they're going to start actually kind of designing and innovating and inventing things. So far, it's really more on the copying side of things. What about India in that sphere? That's still a black box. I think that really, as far as the opportunity there, it's not as powerful as China. You know, as far as innovation out of India, it's relatively low at this point. Looking at Western Europe, why haven't they been a bigger player, given their rich cultural history, sciences and math? Where are they? I don't want to get political, but if you ask me, I think that the structure doesn't really support innovation and risk-taking like it does here in the US. And so I think that plays into it. Obviously, Europe is a lot of smart people there, but I think in the US it just creates more of an entrepreneurial spirit that has really created some amazing products over the last decade. In terms of Facebook, what do you think is their model? We know they get a lot of ads. Is that going to be running into Google big time? Yeah, I think that they'll stay in their separate places. I think Facebook's really focused on building this social graph, really connecting everyone in the world, probably with the exception of China, but really connecting everyone in the world. Google's focus is advertising and obviously trying to get more involved with the phones. But in terms of Facebook, just the impressions are mind-boggling. Last year they served about 14 trillion ads. So it's hard to get our head around how big this platform is, and it's growing at about 200 million users a year. I think Facebook, it's not about, in terms of monetization and the story, it's not about what's happening 2012 or 2014. They're very focused on the user experience. They don't want to abuse the user experience with too many ads, and so they're going slow at it. But eventually, this is real. Facebook is not going to go the way of MySpace. It's going to be part of the fabric of the internet for the next 2 decades. What did they do right in MySpace and the Friendster and all the others do wrong? It started as a closed network. That was the biggest thing. It was an invite network, and what that ended up doing is creating people just basically put their own, their real identities up. And that was really the difference. On MySpace, people would have crazy fake names, and kind of the same with Friendster, and I think that was the core difference between Facebook and some of these others. What other companies excite you these days? I mean, I think the biggest ones, I think Apple and Amazon are probably the most exciting. There's some little ones that we like for example, this LogMe, and it basically is a company that allows you to connect devices. If you believe that people are going to go from a one-device computer to multiple devices, this is an easy way to connect devices. Another company that is this IEC. They have Match, which is an online dating service. Right now, there's in the U.S. about 50 million people that are looking to get connected and date, and there's about 2 million people, 2 to 3 million people online for dating. So there's a big market over time to address that. So those are a couple ones outside of the big ones that we like. Looking at the web, we know what it's done to our industry. People say this wave is going to hit other industries. How do you see the web unfolding and enveloping the world? Well, I think when we look back 10 years from now, I think the web today is going to look still very elementary, and I think there's still a lot of innovation that's going to come. A lot of it's going to come with apps and continuing to progress. Basically, the ability to turn your phone into something else through these app stores. Right now, Apple, for example, has about 600,000 apps, but I think the progression of apps is going to be one thing that's going to really change the web. I think things like Facebook, they have something, this open graph that allows third parties to build applications on top of Facebook. One of them was Zynga with the gaming phenomenon that's really kicked off, but I think you're going to see more and more of that, which is going to really change kind of the social fabric. And then lastly, I think that kind of going on beyond all of this, I think that there's just, how we view the internet, it's just going to be ubiquitous. We still feel like we're reaching out to the internet, but I think it won't be that. It's just going to be part of our everyday lives.
What's the lesson of Yahoo?
The lesson of Yahoo is you got to innovate. I think that they've got some great products, sports, finance, news, but they've missed some big curves. They missed the what happened in social. They missed search. They missed arguably video. They're there today. So I think the lesson is that pay up. I mean, they had an opportunity to buy Facebook, and that they decided not to because of the price. And I think when you see a good technology and you believe in it, don't get price sensitive. And I think if they weren't price sensitive, it would be a very different story than what we're talking about today.
So you think that's a lesson, obviously, Facebook has learned?
Yeah, they paid $1 billion for Instagram. Doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. If you look at when Google bought YouTube, for example, over $1 billion, people are really scratching their heads. What are they doing? What are the metrics to value this? And what it was is a bunch of smart people that saw a trend and really wanted to get ahead of it. And I think that part of the culture is something that Yahoo didn't have under the leadership of Scott Thompson. I think maybe that could change, but that's something the lesson to be learned.
Gene, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.